Hello and welcome in this new video. My name is Marc Lemerty, Head of Customer Education at Astronomer, and today I would like to cover how you can run Airflow at scale, what are the best practices, because I'm about to release my first ever ebook about this topic. So without further ado, let's dive in. So what you can see right here is the ebook that is about best practices for running and managing Apache Airflow at scale. And the first question that you might have is, does Airflow scale? Well, obviously it scales, and it scales pretty well because many big companies, big tech companies are using Airflow today, such as Uber, LinkedIn, Apple, or even OpenAI are actually all using Airflow at scale. They are running thousands of tasks, thousands of data pipelines. So, whenever you see someone telling you, well, Airflow doesn't scale, that's not true at all. That being said, running Airflow at scale brings some challenges like any other tools. But if you don't want to spend time on those challenges, you can use a managed Airflow version like Astro, and that will be much easier than if you use Airflow open source only. So all of that to say, Airflow scales. Now let's take a look at the Airflow 3 architecture. So you have this new architecture with some new components. And it's important to be aware of those components and how you can scale each one of them so that your entire Airflow instance scales. Probably the first component that you will think about scaling is the scheduler, because the scheduler is the heart of Airflow. It schedules your tasks. So obviously you may think that if you add more schedulers, you will be able to schedule more tasks. And that's the case. Actually, I highly recommend you to have at least 2 schedulers for your Airflow instance if you run it at scale. However, we found out that if you add more and more schedulers, that doesn't mean you will get more reliability and better performance. So 2 schedulers is truly all what you need. Moving on to another component, which is the DAG processor. The DAG processor is responsible for retrieving and parsing files from the location that you defined in your DAG bundles. Maybe you don't know about the DAG bundles. I highly recommend you to look at the Airflow 3 documentation. This is new, but in Airflow 3 you have more flexibility on how you want to pull out your DAGs. For example, you can have different locations, like 2 different Git repositories, and you can also determine how often you want to pull out your DAGs from those Git repos, at which interval of time. That being said, we highly recommend you to have at least 2 DAG processors for better performance and high availability, especially if you have many DAGs to process. This is just a sneak peek of how you can scale the different Airflow components. If you want to learn more about that, take a look at the ebook, but let's move on to another topic. So for example, you have the best practices for choosing the right executor. Super important when you scale Airflow. Keep in mind that the executor defines how and on which system you want to run your tasks. And typically you have the following options: the Celery executor, the Kubernetes executor, and the new Edge executor if you're on Airflow open source. The Edge executor allows you to run tasks on remote clusters, so that might be interesting, especially for security reasons. But if you're on Astro, you have the Astro executor that combines the best of the Celery executor and the Kubernetes executor. Which executor you should use highly depends on the infrastructure that you have, your expertise, and also the tasks that you run. Typically, if you run a lot of short-lived tasks, the Celery executor will be much more efficient than the Kubernetes executor. That being said, all the executors you see here scale extremely well. Okay, so that's it for the executor. Let's take a look at another topic. So you will also learn about best practices for managing Airflow infrastructure at scale. As you can see right here, you have another section regarding best practices for roles and permissions, which is pretty important to manage. And then you have the optimizing scaling configurations and parameters. So as you might know, Airflow has many configuration settings that you can change and tune in order to improve the scalability of your Airflow instance. Typically, you have the DAG bag import timeout. If you have many DAGs in your Airflow environment, the import time might time out after the default 30 seconds before all DAGs have been parsed. This is very common. Then you have the DAG processor, DAG file processor timeout, which is how long it takes until one DAG file processor process times out while trying to process a single DAG file. Again, it's very common that you have to increase this value if you have very complex and or dynamic DAGs, and so on. So there are many parameters. This one also, the refresh interval or the mean file process interval. I mean, honestly, this section in the ebook is goldmine. There are so many things that you can tune and change in your Airflow settings that will help you with maybe what you're struggling with today. So that being said, there is another section that I love a lot in this ebook, which is this one: best practices for optimizing your DAG code for scalability. Indeed, the way you write your DAGs will also have a huge impact on the scalability of your Airflow instance. And one of the most obvious one, or maybe not that obvious actually, is to avoid top level code. So as you can see here, you have an example of that, but it's very common to fetch a variable or a connection outside of a task. And anything that it is outside of a task is considered as top level code. So what's the issue with that? Well, remember that the DAG file processor parses your DAGs every 30 seconds by default. And so each time it does that, because you are fetching a variable or a connection outside of a task, you make a connection to the Airflow metadatabase or whatever third-party service you use to store those connections and variables. So imagine that now you have a lot of variables and connections that you fetch outside of your tasks. You are creating a lot of workload on your Airflow metadatabase or a third-party service that you use for nothing, because your DAGs don't run, but still every 30 seconds, because the DAG file processor passes every 30 seconds those DAG files, you are making those requests. So as a best practice, we recommend you to avoid as much as you can top level code. And for that, you can use Jinja templates, which is very useful to actually solve this issue. There are other things that you can do at the code level. For example, you can avoid heavy imports. You also can use task groups to better manage DAGs with many tasks. And you can even reuse some of the logics that you have in one DAG in other DAGs using task groups. So this is super useful. You can also use deferrable operators. There are many things that you can do at the code level, and you will find plenty of resources and things that you can do in this ebook. I mean, I just love this part. Then you have the best practices for software development lifecycle. So when you run Airflow at scale, obviously you have to have a CI/CD strategy in place. Otherwise, it's going to be a nightmare for you to deploy your changes. This will be easier if you use Astro for obvious reason, right? With Astro, you can have different deployments in a few clicks, but regardless, we recommend you developing a CI/CD pipeline that supports multiple environments for running and testing different versions of your project, such as a production, staging, and development environment. Finally, you have the best practices for monitoring and observability. The bigger your Airflow instance is, the more you will have to monitor. And again, you have to have a proper system in place, like some notifiers to get notified when you are having issues with your tasks or DAGs, so you can get notified on Slack or other communication channels that you want, and so on. So that's it for this quick video. Again, I highly recommend you to download my first ever ebook. I'm sure you will love it, and you will learn a lot about how to finally run Airflow at scale following best practices. So thank you so much for this video, and I see you for next one. Take care.